5. Great. So I'll be just giving us kind of a basic update on CASAS today, as well as I personally like to talk about remote testing and e-testing. So if we have any time for questions at the end, feel free to ask whatever's kind of on your mind about CASAS. Most likely, if it's an issue that your program is, having some questions about, most likely other programs in Michigan are also having some similar questions. So throughout the presentation, feel free to give just your questions throughout the chat, but we'll definitely reserve time at the end to answer any other questions that you might have. So today, some of our business that I'm going to talk about is just what the status is of some of our test development, some of the new writing assessments that CASAS has. So those are some opportunities for pilot testing, if you would be interested in that. We have some new products that are essential for accommodations for test takers with any visual impairment. We'll be talking a little bit more about some of the remote testing aspects, different features in e-tests and TE, as well as various opportunities for professional development. So for our NRS approved assessments, so the NRS is the National Reporting Service, which is the federal body that determines which assessments are acceptable in adult education in terms of funding resources. So if you are receiving any type of a WIOA or federal funding, sometimes a stipulation of that contract is that you have to use an NRS approved assessment. So for CASAS assessments, reading goals and math goals are both our NRS approved for adult basic education for ABE. For reading goals, it's approved through 2025. And for the math goals, it's approved through 2023. For ESL, or English as a second language, the CASAS approved assessments are most popular, Life and Work Reading, the 80 series, and Life and Work Listening, the 980 series. There's some other forms you may or may not be familiar with. The Beginning Literacy Assessment, forms 27 and 28R, that is kind of considered like a pre-ESL level. It's for very low-level learners who may not be literate in their native language. We also have some forms that's Reading for Language Arts, which are forms 513 and 514. Those forms specifically are still NRS approved for ESL. So you could still use those in your ESL programs in order to show learning gains. So the CASAS ESL assessments are all approved through February of 2023. And this is like all ESL tests that are currently available in adult ed. They are all set to expire in February 2023. So that's a nice segue into what is CASAS doing next? What are we going to do about it? What is kind of next steps looking like for CASAS assessments? Specifically for ESL, we're moving towards developing a new reading goals and listening goals for ESL. I'm not quite sure if they're going to keep the name the same. GOALS is an acronym that stands for Greater Opportunities for Adult Learner Success. So currently, if you are participating in field testing, you may have already seen some of this, but they are looking at the final forms of what those assessments would look like when they go to print and they become available in e-tests. So we are collecting data on that through June 30th of 2022, and that will be submitted in the fall for NRS approval. Typically, you would submit in the fall, and then by spring, I think February or March, you'll hear whether or not your assessment was approved. So that's kind of what our timeline looks like for the ESL reading goals and listening goals. This would be a different test than our current reading goals test for ABE. So for ABE and ASE though, we have reading goals and math goals. A next series is in development, especially for math goals. We'll be looking towards adding various other levels. Currently, it's just a level AB and a level CD. So that's what's in development. For reading goals, we are also just kind of field testing right now other items for various other test forms. If you are interested in field testing, if you've never participated before, it's a great way to kind of see what things are looking for in the future in terms of CASAS testing. So right now their content areas are listening and reading for ESL, as well as math for ABE ASE. If you do work with very low level ESL learners, please, please participate if you can in field testing. That I know is definitely a student group that we really want to make sure that our future assessments are matching their needs. So if you have a population like that you're working with frequently, they'd be great candidates for field testing. So students receive a $5 gift card for each field test that they complete, and then agencies will receive complimentary web test units for their participation. The way that it works is if your agency is already set up for e-tests, we would add some field testing sessions into your account, and that's what you would use for the field tests that you would gather with your students on e-tests. And there's also an option to field test on paper and pencil. So if your program is kind of new to e-testing or new to CASAS assessments, this can be a great opportunity to kind of get to see what it looks like. It's also an opportunity to, if you're working with students that are new to standardized testing, you could have them go ahead and take the field test first, and then go ahead and take a pre-test later on. So they're kind of figuring out how to test. So great. So a question in the chat is if we want to become involved in field testing with the new ESL testing, who would we contact? So our field test coordinator at CASAS is my colleague, Karen Berger. Her email address is kberger, BURGER at CASAS.org. And then if you also call the CASAS number, her extension is 177. Yes, so a great point to bring up too. Sometimes people see an FT marked towards a general test item or a test question. That does mean that field test items are embedded currently. Let me get to my next slide to talk a little bit more about that. Oh, sorry. So basically, there are current unscored embedded field test items and math goals and reading goals that are being selected. If you've ever worked with a student and notice in parentheses FT, that means that there's a field testing item embedded in the test. Typically on those test forms, there are about 38 questions in what's scored. There may be 40 questions that appear. When a student gets an embedded field test item in their test, essentially the timer stops and that embedded field test item is not incorporated into their score. That's information that goes back to the CASAS item test development team, and they use that information as they are kind of developing final test forms. You do not receive complimentary WTUs when you have FT showing up in field testing for the embedded field test items. But if you participate in the field testing, like with my colleague, Karen Berger, so let me just go back to that slide. Oops. You would have the opportunity to receive complimentary WTUs for your agency. So even if it's as little as like 5 students that complete the full ESL math or reading pretest, you'd be eligible to receive WTUs. So small agencies, large agencies, feel free to participate. Even just the smallest amount really helps. It's also a way for your agency to kind of see what your students are seeing. So if there's question items that are, questionable, which is hopefully not the case in a final form study, you can give your input to at that level. So we really appreciate the field testing study that participates within the field. And there's also just a reminder too, if you're currently using eTests, you may see some of those embedded field test items. Make sure that the demographics that are being collected of your students include gender, native language, ethnicity, and race. Students only complete this at intake, so it's only completed once. But if your agency is not already collecting those details, If possible, if you could, please update your eTest account so that you are collecting them. So in addition to field testing for the new ESL reading and listening, CASAS is also developing some writing and language tests. For the writing, it's a written prompt essay. Students would have 45 minutes to an hour to complete it, and it's going to be auto scored. So the test results are automatically available. It is scored by an algorithm, essentially a machine learning rather than human scoring. So CASAS has been developing this for the last few years based on, if you guys are familiar with any DP program with CASAS, there is a diagnostic written prompt essay that's been used. So this is some of the studies that have been used for validation in order to basically check the accuracy of using this scoring mechanism. It's in development to be delivered on the eTest platform. This is kind of just what a sample essay prompt would be about, healthy eating habits, and then students would have about, again, 45 minutes to an hour to complete. And then for both, there's also a multiple choice language test that would be available. This is looking at screening for readiness to pass a high school equivalency exam, a transition to post-secondary work, instruction or work. This is going to be looking at assisting in placement, guiding instruction. It would be 2 test levels, so perhaps a level A and a level B, and then 2 forms per level, so about 4 forms in total. It would be 20 to 30 minutes. And so for this new multiple choice language test, it's really for students at NRS 3 or higher. It's going to be aligned to the CCRS language standards, and the results would be reported as a new CASAS language scale. Diagnostic information will be provided about that test. So for both of the writing and the language assessments, they're only going to be available through CASAS eTests. They're not going to be available on paper. The cost would essentially just be 1 WTU. Students can take 1 or both tests. At this time, it's not submitted for NRS approval for pre, so it wouldn't exactly be available for pre and post test accountability reporting. It's totally optional. And the availability is going to be determined based on some of these studies that we're completing. So like the pre-testing, if you would be interested in doing the pilot test for writing in either just the essay prompt, the multiple choice language test, or both, definitely contact us at casas@casas.org, and we can connect you with the pilots that are going on for this project. So the writing and language are, I think, both pretty open right now in terms of who they are available to. Sorry, so I think it was the NRS level 3, but let me check if that is. So for students at an NRS level 3, I know the language component, I think, is ABE and ESL in some states. So that's what CASAS is developing in terms of that. So I think it would probably favor an ABE student rather than an ESL, just because you need to be at that certain threshold in order to really benefit from the prompt. So this probably would not be a match for low-level ESL learners, but if you want to, find out more about it, just connect with us and we can let you know. So just also really quick, we have some materials that are available for test takers that have visual impairment or blindness. So all CASAS eTests are compatible with the screen reader software. So what that is a screen reader software provides test directions, a description of the prompts, test questions, and then answer options. So a scribe is still needed, but this is available for all of the reading goals, test forms, all of the math goals, test forms, and then for life and work reading, levels B, C, the forms 83, 84, 185, and 186. So there is a supplement for test takers as well. This provides the test administration guidelines for both CASAS e-tests and for paper-based tests. And then we also have an additional component that's the tactile graphics or Braille supplement. So if you have students that are familiar with reading Braille, you could use this as well for test items that are difficult for both CASAS e-tests and for the paper-based test. So those are some new products that you may want to consider, especially if you have funding at the end of the year, just so that you're prepared if you have a student that comes in that has visual impairment, so that we can provide them the best testing experience. Just another point for CASAS is periodically we conduct cooperative studies with the GED testing service. So you may already know this, but CASAS basically looks at what the results of CASAS test scores, and then they have students take that test within 7 days, either the GED or the HiSET, to predict a student's likelihood of passing. So currently on CASAS assessments, the likelihood of passing is marked as low, medium, or high. So a student that has a high level of passing, they would be ready to basically sit for their GED or HiSET based on their reading or math scores. Someone who gets a low may need more study required in order to pass. So it appears like this in a small section, and then you can also have that appear on the bottom of an individual skills profile, is typically where that would be shown. Yeah, so we have a question about the citizenship test as a CASAS requirement to go through. Yeah, there's a different set of instructions for the citizenship test. So you would need to email CASAS@casas.org in order to talk more about that with them if you're using it, or if you are looking at ordering. The citizenship test itself is separate from the life and work reading series. There is a government and history component test to it. There's also a mock interview component that we provide training for. So you can use the life and work reading series, which is our NRS approved ones for ESL, the life and work reading and the life and work listening, if you're just offering citizenship classes. If you're also going to be reporting those as gains, you can do that. Or you can look into the citizenship testing that CASAS has. Yeah, and I will have my email at the end of this presentation. So if we haven't emailed already, or if you have any kind of remaining questions, if I need to talk with one of my colleagues on a little bit more, we can always get that answer to you after this presentation. So I wanted to give you some of our CASAS remote testing updates. So was kind of in general a silver lining of COVID. It really expanded the use of technology across programs as they began to look at online testing, as well as a lot of programs themselves started instituting distance learning. So there was a huge interest in CASAS e-tests as a result by a lot of programs that traditionally, felt safe with paper tests. So CASAS saw a really big influx. I know in Michigan specifically, there had been a huge push for CASAS e-tests in 2018. So I think a lot of Michigan agencies were much better situated for the pandemic than in other parts of the country. So definitely, should feel pride as a Michigander in terms of how you dealt with the pandemic and testing. So there's also just a greater flexibility in administering assessments remotely. I know even just from attending the K over the last few years, dealing with childcare, gas money, transportation issues for students, typically they would have to test in person. Now we have this option so that if a student can't attend a day on their post-test to attend in person, they would be able to take that test remotely. So for CASAS remote testing, we have 4 approaches. A lot of this is coming from the approach that it's not a one size fits all type of a situation. We have students of different abilities. We have different types of technology that's available to them. So I think as a program, you may kind of use some of these approaches in different ways, especially depending upon the devices that your students would be using to test. When I'm working with programs about starting remote testing, I always kind of ask some of these first few questions to consider. Um, how many staff members are going to be working on proctoring? What are the digital literacy skills of your staff members? Are they comfortable using e-tests? Are they comfortable using Zoom? Are they comfortable using a breakout room in Zoom? So those are kind of important facts to consider for the students. Sometimes we're remote testing a student that you're familiar with, they're returning, it's a post-test, they just can't come in, versus students that are totally new to your program. Considering whether or not that student is ESL, ABE, what is their digital literacy skill like? Are they comfortable, in Zoom? Are they comfortable taking a standardized test? Those are questions that you may not have all the answers to at the time of testing. What really needs to be asked directly is what device would they be testing on? Do they have access to stable internet for at least 2 hours? Are they on a computer, Windows 10, a laptop, a tablet, a Chromebook, an iPad? And so, yeah, for the equipment too, for your program, are the students going to be using devices that they own? Are they loaned to them by your program? Does your program own those? Are they borrowing a device from a friend? Also, will proctors, what types of computers are your proctors using? I know at one point during the pandemic, a lot of people were shut out of their typical office space. So everyone was working remotely. I think now some of that flexibility has opened up. So even for proctors, are you using like an office computer in order to proctor the test or working completely remote from home? So yeah, I would say the best approach to use, there's some pros and cons to each approach. I would say is definitely going to be this one-to-many for students that are using Windows 10 PCs. This is absolutely our best approach if your students have Windows 10 computers and they have some digital literacy skills. This is going to be the best way for your agency to test multiple students at once. Right now, our ratio is 5 students to 1 proctor. So one of the kind of drawbacks is that the student needs to manage the Zoom breakout room. For a student on a second device, they may still need that for Zoom. And they also need to be able to register by code, which I have some slides that kind of just showcase what that is. I also have some slides that are kind of talking about next steps into the future for CASAS. We are looking at having a larger ratio of students per proctor. Sorry, let me just go ahead and jump over to that slide. So just some reminders about remote testing with CASAS is the only NRS approved tests that are permitted for remote testing are e-tests. Paper tests are not considered to be permitted for remote testing. So it's not permitted to copy, scan, or reproduce CASAS paper tests. You can't send paper tests to students for them to take at home. And it's also not permitted to record the testing session. I know initially when we started remote testing, we weren't sure if we were going to have them recorded or not, but due to a lot of data and privacy issues, we're not recording the testing sessions. For test takers that are using remote testing, they cannot use a Zoom virtual background or any type of a filtered background setting. One of the main points of components of that is the proctor needs to be able to see the room. So we obviously can't use a virtual background for that. So we are kind of encouraging programs to kind of be creative and work with the needs of their students. A lot of times in adult ed, we really know our students best. I think far better than CASAS may know your students. So, make sure that you can accommodate the students as best you can, but also make sure to follow the guidelines to ensure test security. So for some of the new directions in testing that we are looking at, is remote testing, one proctor up to 12 students. Using that approach, we're participating in a pilot. Our pilot studies were slowed down over the summer as not that many students were testing at that time. So we put them on hold. And now this fall, we're beginning to participate in these pilots again. We are looking at doing remote testing of listening, reading, and math on phones. So we're open to new pilot sites. If that's something that you would like to participate in, email us at remotetesting@casas.org. We're also looking at developing, with a lot of our remote testing, there's been a need for a second device. So the student will test on their own computer, and then Zoom is sometimes whitelisted, or other web conferencing softwares are whitelisted. So eTest doesn't lock them out, so they don't need the second device. But what we're hoping for is that there's no second video conferencing software that's needed. So it would just be through your eTest application. So our programmers have been working on integrating that in alpha testing. There's also always been some questions about remote testing with a third-party proctoring service. I would say if you are interested in doing this, or if you know of other programs that you're working with that are, definitely send us an email. If there's enough interest in the field, we could potentially work with a third-party proctoring service, but right now that is not permitted for CASAS remote testing. I will save time at the end of our presentation if we have more questions on remote testing today, if we want to talk about that more. Otherwise, just some tips in TE and E-tests. One of the biggest differences was the ability to register by code. If you started working with CASAS to register computers back in 2018, you may remember that we used to require 2 users to validate station registration. With the pandemic, we removed the second user, so you can just register computers as one person now. The other thing that you can do is you can register a computer by code. The reason why we started implementing that was so that basically for remote testing, so students can essentially be given a code, register their own device, and then use that device to test remotely. So the registration code is unique to a session. It's also available now for on-site testing, not just remote testing. But when you are remote testing, the proctor would need to share that code with the students. The students will need to go to etestonline.org, and then they will follow the Take a Test button. Also, if you're an older user of CASAS, you may remember we used to have a button that said Take a Test, and right underneath it, it said register this computer, register this station. We've removed the register this station. Now, when you just click Take a Test, if your computer is not registered, it will prompt you to register it. When you are using remote testing, the proctor needs to enable the test on the testing session screen so that the student can begin testing. And this is what that computer screen looks like now under station management. Register station with code versus register station with credentials. Register station with credentials is kind of that traditional, you put in your agency ID, your work email address, and then your password so that you are registering a computer. For the registration by code, I've just got some quick slides on that, what that looks like. From the proctor view, you log in as normal. You go ahead and start your testing session as normal. This is also new for CASAS. Now you see start on-site versus start remote session. So you would click here for the remote session. You're going to get that registration code, that 7-digit code that will appear. That code is shared with students so that when they go to etestonline.org and click Take a Test, this is the next screen that they will see. They'll put in that code and it'll appear like this for them. Your station has been registered. It's okay to proceed. For those of you who have used eTest before, it's the same screen that would appear whether you're on site, but for the student in their remote, home office or wherever it is that they're testing, they would see it like this. they'll put in the information about themselves. So it's also a good to just give them the student ID that you would like them to use at the time of testing. And they'll see a screen that says, please wait for the proctor when they are remote testing. On the proctor's screen, they'll be able to see when students are basically completing the information that they need. Oh, sorry, I lost a picture there. So for the proctor, it'll appear the student's name, and there's a button that just says enable test. So the proctor needs to click that button to enable the test before the screen looks like this for the student. And again, this is just the same as on-site testing. It's just seen remotely for the student that they select either the reading locator or the math locator if they are at intake and pre-testing. So registering by code is a temporary registration, registered by code. So it'll only be registered for the duration of the test. Registering station by credentials is a way to permanently register that machine. So if it's a student device, you would probably want to just do it by code. Whereas if it is a device that's owned by your program, you don't want to have to be registering it again and again. So you'll go with the registration by credentials. So for remote testing, I'd say our best piece of advice is to practice, practice, practice. We've seen a lot of success in the field when staff members practiced remote testing with each other. And after they really felt comfortable role-playing student or proctor, then they started working with students. So CASAS has a default practice testing session, which I'd encourage you to use for this purpose. It doesn't use any WTUs. And then again, too, if you've had any experience remote testing and you'd like to share that with your colleagues, please feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat of just letting us know, even if it's, any successes or failures that you'd like to share. CASAS has a number of resources on our website under the CASAS remote testing page. There's a video that shows the remote control, so the testing one-to-one. Again, I would not recommend this to be the approach that you take with all students, just in the sense it's really time consuming because you can only use one proctor to one student. It's best used with students with very low digital literacy skills. So many of your students are probably pretty competent on their smartphones, on e-tests, on Zoom. So they would have the ability to register their own machine by code and then go ahead and move forward testing that way. So these are just some links to other CASAS materials that might be helpful. Another feature within CASAS that is not strictly remote testing, but is probably little known unless you've attended one of our webinars and you might have heard a mention of this, is something called the Data Transfer Wizard. What the Data Transfer Wizard does is it allows the student test record in TE to be transferred to another agency's account in TE. So let's say you have a student that attends a Michigan Works site. They pre-test at the Michigan Works location, and it's determined that their math or reading scores are quite low, and they really need a bit of extra help. So they're being sent to another adult education program locally. The Michigan Works agency can transfer those pre-test scores over to your program. So you have access of how the student performed on reading and math. They do not need to test again. You can work with the student, you can place them, their test scores are in your account, and you can just post-test them. So they don't have to go through the whole pre-test intake again. It will post-test them based on their initial score because that information is in your account. So if that's a situation that might apply, even if you have a student that moved, they really enjoyed taking ESL, they moved from one location within the state to another. They're looking to enroll again in ESL instruction. You can kind of help. It just avoids duplicating efforts in terms of the student, in terms of having your program use a WTU that they can save. and still get the test score. So if you want any more information about that, please let us know on our tech support team or just looking it up on our website, the Data Transfer Wizard. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the different components that CASAS is offering in terms of professional development. We have our self-paced trainings online. If you're new to CASAS e-tests or new to CASAS in general, CASAS requires all new e-tests or paper test customers to complete a series of self-paced trainings online. Our trainings are completely free. So also for programs that are, long-term CASAS e-tests or paper test, users, if you have new employees or new staff members that you're taking on, please have them complete some of these self-paced online trainings. So just always kind of a resource for you. Yeah, so in the chat, we will make sure that you guys have a copy of this presentation. We'll post it through the Whova app. How does post-testing work? Does the proctor have to manually increase the test form, or does the software automatically increase the test form if it detects that a student has already taken a pre-test? So that is a great question. For CASAS, if you're familiar with our paper tests, the way that it would work for the paper tests is the proctor would grade the test level and then refer to something called the test administration manual. That is what has your answer keys. You look up, if a student was on 84R, they got a score of 220, what you would take for the next assigned test. That would be probably, so in general, if the student is in one test form, they do mediumly well, the next score that's going to be given to them is staying within that test form. Or if they go higher up, if they do really well, they'll be moved up a level. If they do very poorly, they may even need to move down a level. So in general, that's kind of how the next assigned test works. So the post-testing sessions on CASAS e-tests also work using that same framework. The way that it would be coded for a paper test score is how it will work in the e-test platform. So the proctor does not need to hand select a specific test. You don't need to select a testing session for 84R or 85R, 185R only. Basically, the CASAS default testing session for post-testing will do that work for you. So it is automatic through the website. Yeah, so just also as we're kind of in the chat here, just for a moment, we're on the CASAS website. So we have information about the data transfer wizard under our TE help page. And I think I have some slides about that, but also if you're on the CASAS website, you use the search bar at the top, the data transfer wizard is very helpful if you just use that as your key terms. Yes, we also have accommodations for any types of visual impairment or other types of developmental impairments for CASAS testing on our website. We have accommodations for test takers underneath our assessments. And again, if you can't find any of these details, I will show my email address at the end. Feel free to message me through the course of this conference, or we can also email outside of the Whova platform and talk after this as well. All right, so into our slides. Also, it's not as relevant in Michigan, but I know in some other states, it's important sometimes to get a copy of your certificate. As soon as you complete your training, if you need the copy of the certificate, there's an option to just follow these components and get the certificate. So you can't get a certificate for trainings that you've completed prior to June 30th. So keep that in mind if you're a new employee or if you are looking at that in your staffing, and that's important for you. CASAS help and documentation videos are also available on Moodle on our training index. There's an index, so whether or not you just want to learn more about CASAS or there's something specific that you're looking at, that's going to be in alphabetical order, so you can take a look at that. So for other CASAS news that we also have to share. CASAS has something called office hours. They are typically twice a month on Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can register in advance or just join us that day. Sometimes we have a larger group or a smaller group that attends, but if you have a specific problem or you just want to learn more and learn what other people are asking about or talking about, feel free to join us. So we typically have, I typically attend, a colleague of mine, Karen, who does field testing, also typically attends. We typically have a member of tech support that's also on hand. So if we are super popular, we may break out into breakout rooms to talk more in depth. But also if we are a smaller group, it can be a great opportunity for you to attend and really get that individualized attention that you might need for your program. So yeah, attending participants really drive the session with their questions and needs. So we really just, whatever you guys want to talk about that day, we'll go ahead and talk about it. There's also something that I think would be of interest, especially in Michigan, is TE network meetings. This is something probably for more experienced CASAS users, or if your role as the data manager at your agency and you want to make sure that you're staying with the best practices and what TE offers, it might also be helpful for any assessment specialists or assessment coordinators to attend. These are typically offered every other month.
No.
You can look up the meeting info and what's new on the CASAS website. So these meetings focus on kind of higher level or like intermediate level CASAS TE features. They'll talk about NRS guidelines, TE teach features such as the TE proxy wizard, test results, reports, tips and tricks. And again, it's totally an open format in the sense of they'll let you know some of the updates, but if you have specific questions, you can ask them. And you can also learn a lot. People from all over the country join the TE network meetings. So definitely feel free to join if that's something that aligns with your role at your organization. TE is TOPS Pro Enterprise. TOPS Pro Enterprise is the data accountability software that CASAS uses in conjunction with CASAS eTests. So CASAS does not send any reminder emails, but I will bring that to our team to see if, maybe we can generate a little bit more email interest in some of those meetings. I think historically they were only open to California agencies, but now they are national and we're building more of a national presence. So I will bring that suggestion for sure to our team to see if we can see that a little bit more. I did try to look on our website to see when it was scheduled for before our presentation today, but unfortunately I did not have a date yet. Yeah, well, I'm glad that we are talking about this because I consider Michigan to be such a strong CASAS state. So I'm glad to hear that, these are new topics for some people. So it's good to know, just so you guys can get more involved and, our favorite Midwestern state to get a little bit more. So CASAS also has something called our news and updates webinars. We do get this question. It's pretty much just CASAS updates. So if you're totally new to CASAS, if you are looking on more information, the news and updates webinar may not be the best use of your time. I would say something like office hours would probably be quite better, or some of our self-paced trainings if you're completely new to CASAS. But our next webinar will be Wednesday, November 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern. So please feel free to join. Those sessions are always recorded. So if you can't join that day, you can always tune in later on. And there are also the slides that are available as well. And then finally, in terms of CASAS professional development, CASAS will be having our Summer Institute next year in person. We typically hold it in San Diego at a hotel called the Town and Country Resort. So we will be hosting it this year, June 14th through June 16th. Our registration will be available in January. And if you work on presenting or if you volunteer as a CASAS trainer, you can receive a discounted registration or hotel fees. So if you're interested in attending, either just as an attendee or as a presenter, please let us know. So we can just, help direct your email to our Summer Institute organizers. Oh, thanks, Gigi. I appreciate that suggestion. Gigi just mentioned in the chat that a lot of programs have switched to online testing due to COVID. So more informational sessions on the use of TE would be appreciated. Since I've gotten through all of our slides, maybe even let me go over to the CASAS website to just kind of show you where some of these resources are. Another popular session for TE is something called TE Basics, which due to the pandemic, we're only offering online right now. So if you've never taken a TE Basics with one of our tech support members leading it, I would recommend it. It's usually offered like once a month. And so even if you are a long-term CASAS eTest or TE user, it might just be nice as a refresher or to see if there's any new information that you may not have been aware of. So just for a moment, this is my email address. Again, I will be on Whova tomorrow as well. And I think Whova is an awesome platform. So many thanks to McKay and the wonderful organizers that help put on this conference every fall. It's definitely a highlight for me. I love attending the McKay Fall Conference, even if it's virtual. So please feel free to send me a message either through Whova or via email if you have any other questions. I'm happy to help.
You made my job easy because you were watching the chat faster than I was.
Like, let me jump over to the CASAS website for a second, just so I can kind of show you guys where some of those resources are that we talked about.
I do have a quick question while you're looking for that. When it comes to the whatever wizard, I lost the name now, but you said like Michigan Works, they can transfer their data to us in Tops Pro.
Yes.
Is it pretty simple? My worry is some of us have really good working relationships with our Michigan Works and some don't. So is it something that's like got to be in depth, making sure that both sides are? How much work does it add, I guess? Make sure
Good
Michigan Works
question.
organizations are going to
Honestly,
be like, hey, we can do that.
Well, it's super simple and it's really easy. As long as both agencies are on TE, you do not need, again, like a background in computer science to have this work out. Just, I think there was another question about that, about where that resource is. So training and support on the CASAS website, and then broken into TE help documentation or TOPS Pro Enterprise help. So we frequently abbreviate that as TE. So my apologies if that was confusing to folks. But just looking here on data exchange, even if you just you have some time and you want to kind of build your skills, I find this to be a really helpful resource. Transferring student data between agencies. And I can even just share this in the chat. This is our data transfer wizard. You can do it for a single record or you can do it for multiple. What happens when you're requesting data from another agency? You basically, the most important aspect is to make sure that the data sharing consent was signed. You can't transfer data until, that's not a formal documentation by CASAS. It's just an extra built in for data privacy. So the screen will look like this, and you can kind of follow these step by step. I won't go through it all now, I guess. But just kind of to show, you can look up the other agency title if you don't know their agency ID. You can make sure that you're looking it up within the state of Michigan. So you would be able to share that information with each other. And again, this is from the TOPS for Enterprise help page in CASAS on our website. I'll share this link as well.
That might be very handy because we've gotten some scores from our Michigan Works, but they've sent score reports and I had to go in and manually enter those into TOPS Pro on my end. And so this might be easy, might be a lot easier.
Yeah, it's definitely nicer to use than having to manually enter it. And the nice thing is it stays in their account. So when they're reporting for federal documentation, like they would still get the points for testing students, but then your program also gets points for having a paired test score as well. So it's not like when they transfer the data to your organization, they're losing that component. Both agencies get to keep the test scores in their account. And I know we had talked about too at the beginning, some of these, great CASAS resources that we have just from the homepage. We have remote testing here. We have office hours registration, news and updates webinars, field testing opportunities. There's also more help documentation and some videos that accompany that. So even too, for some of the other trainings that we have for some live facilitated, for TOPS for Enterprise, this is the National TE Network meeting. So I will make sure that we maybe send that out in a global email for the next time. Oh, great. They actually just announced this. So this is for November 12th, this training page. And then sometimes we also have our TOPS Pro Enterprise training that's available here too. This is that TE Basics that I was talking about. So we don't have a date for the next one just yet, but we do have kind of a version of that from October 22nd when they're talking about it. For our live office hours, our next upcoming office hours are November 5th, November 19th, December 3rd, and December 17th. And that's at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And then, we also have our CASAS news and updates webinars as well. So for the news and updates webinars, our next one is in November. So those are important to tune into. But again, if you can't tune into it, afterwards, we annotate each of the sections. So instead of having to watch the entire webinar again, if you're very busy, you can kind of just skip to the points that might be relevant to you or the topics of interest. So sometimes we have a guest presenter that'll just talk on something relevant. If you're ever interested in talking, please reach out to us. And we're happy to talk about anything that you guys are doing in your program and how it relates to testing. You can also kind of get ideas from previous webinars too. They're always kind of marked like that. So you can go ahead and watch some follow-up information if that would be helpful for you. All right, and if there's any other questions, again, I will be checking my Whova app regularly over the next few days or tomorrow. So please feel free to reach out. And if not, let me go back to my last slide to just kind of give you guys my email address and some other CASAS email addresses too, for anything that might be helpful for you guys.
Well, thank you. We appreciate everything. I haven't seen any other questions come through. Just bunch of thank yous. Couple of reminders to everybody that's still here. If you're looking for the sketches, the form for sketches is still, it's under the resources, but I believe it's also going to be emailed out to everybody tomorrow. At least that's what I was told. So don't hold me to that 100%, but it should be. And other than that, appreciate everybody being here and everybody tuning in to whatever sessions you went through. Hopefully everything was enjoyable. I know this one is useful. I've learned several things I didn't know, and I considered myself to be somewhat adept at Tops Pro and CASAS. I do know since I've switched from TABE, I've been way happier with CASAS, so I greatly appreciate that. Other than that, unless anybody's got anything else, I think we're good to call it a day. And thank you, Elizabeth, for everything.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I'll make sure that my slide gets posted to our session today. But yeah, totally reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, there's one question.
Oh, so thank you so much for the question about the writing and language assessments. They specified an NRS level 3. I assume that is the ABE NRS level 3. So I know there's a little bit of overlap with the ESL NRS levels, but I think it's still in the pilot phases. So I'm not sure if that's always going to be the case and if that's definite, but I think they're looking more for ABE learners. So my apologies for not being clear on that. I'm not sure if they are still in piloting for both. So.
Perfect. Well, I think if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and call it a day. I just got to remember how to stop the recording.